was 1965. The most dangerous man in New York City sat in a diner on 125th Street. This was a man who had gone to war with the Italian Mafia and won. A man who had survived Alcatraz. A man who held the entire Harlem underworld in the palm of his hand. But on this specific day, the King of Harlem wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking over his shoulder, because for all the hitmen, corrupt cops, and mob bosses he had buried, there was one person Bumpy Johnson actually feared. And it wasn't a mobster. It was the only man he couldn't bribe, couldn't bully, and couldn't kill. To understand why this fear was so unusual, you have to understand the man himself. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. In the streets of Harlem, he was the professor. He treated organized crime like a game of chess while everyone else was playing checkers. For 30 years, Bumpy stood as the gatekeeper between the powerful Italian five families and the black community of Harlem. When the sociopathic mobster Dutch Schultz tried to take over the numbers racket in the 1930s, Bumpy didn't just survive him. He outmaneuvered him until the commission had Schultz eliminated. When Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello wanted to do business uptown, they didn't send soldiers to kick down doors. They called Bumpy. They understood that you did not touch the King of Harlem unless you wanted a war you couldn't win. So, who could rattle a man like that? Who could make the Godfather of Harlem feel genuine fear? Today, we are going to dissect the strange, complex, and hidden relationship between Bumpy Johnson and the one figure who challenged his very existence. A relationship that started with a mentorship in the streets, twisted into a rivalry of ideologies, and ended with blood on the floor of the Audubon Ballroom. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious truth behind history's most notorious figures, you've come to the right place. Before we get to the man Bumpy feared, we have to establish why Bumpy was fearless. Most people think of gangsters as thugs, brutes with guns. But Bumpy Johnson was an intellectual. He read Nietzsche and history books. He studied the tactics of Napoleon. And when he arrived in Harlem from Charleston, South Carolina, he saw a chaotic criminal underworld that lacked order. He started as an enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair on the Queen of the Numbers. At the time, the Italian mob, specifically Dutch Schultz, saw Harlem as a cash cow ready for slaughter. They began a campaign of terror. They beat up number runners. They smashed up storefronts. They killed anyone who wouldn't pay the tax. And they had a problem named Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't fight like a street thug. He fought like a guerrilla commander. He used the terrain of Harlem, the alleyways, the rooftops, the basements, to ambush Schultz's men. He unleashed a level of strategic violence that the Italians simply weren't ready for. There is a famous story, some say it's a legend, but police reports from the era back it up, where Bumpy walked alone into a club owned by a rival mobster. He was unarmed. When the rival pulled a knife, Bumpy didn't flinch. He simply picked up a chair and moved with such speed and ferocity that he neutralized 3 armed men before the first drink hit the floor. By the 1940s, Bumpy had achieved what was called the Pax Johnson. Peace through superior firepower and superior intellect. He was the judge, jury, and executioner of uptown New York. He carried a switchblade, he carried a shotgun, but his most dangerous weapon was his reputation. And it was at the height of this power, in the mid-1940s, that Bumpy Johnson met a young, street-hustling kid named Malcolm Little. The man Bumpy would eventually fear didn't start as an enemy. He started as a fan. In the 1940s, Malcolm Little, who the streets knew as Detroit Red, was a small-time hustler. He was flashy. He wore bright suits, conked his hair with lye, and dealt in everything from drugs to burglary. To a kid like Detroit Red, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a god. Bumpy represented the pinnacle of what a black man could achieve in a segregated America. He had money, he had respect, and he made white men nervous. Detroit Red wanted to be close to that power. And Bumpy? He took a liking to the kid. Witnesses from the era describe an almost father-son dynamic. Bumpy saw potential in Detroit Red. Red was smart, charismatic, and had a fire in his belly. Bumpy allowed Red to operate in his territory. He offered him protection. He taught him the nuances of the street, how to read people, how to spot a setup, how to command a room without raising your voice. But there was a fundamental difference between them. Bumpy was cold, calculated, and patient. Detroit Red was erratic and hot-headed. There's a specific incident that highlights this. Detroit Red was known for carrying a pistol he barely knew how to use. Bumpy, who treated violence as a profession, looked at Red's chaotic lifestyle with a mix of amusement and concern. He knew a kid like that was destined for one of two things, a coffin or a cage. And Bumpy was right. In 1946, Detroit Red was arrested for burglary and sentenced to Charlestown State Prison. Shortly after, Bumpy's luck ran out too. In 1952, he was sentenced to Alcatraz for a drug conspiracy charge, a charge he claimed until his dying day was a frame-up. For the next decade, both men were removed from the board. The king sat on a rock in San Francisco Bay. The apprentice sat in a cell in Massachusetts. But while Bumpy was doing push-ups and playing chess to keep his mind sharp and maintaining his identity as a gangster, Malcolm Little was dying, and in his place, something else was being born. When Detroit Red went to prison, he was a criminal. When he came out in 1952, he was Malcolm X. He had joined the Nation of Islam. He had given up pork, alcohol, drugs, and the slave name Little. He was no longer a hustler looking for a quick buck. He was a minister looking for souls. And this is where the story shifts. Because when Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in 1963 and returned to Harlem, he expected to find the world exactly as he left it. He expected to walk back onto 125th Street and be greeted as the king. And in many ways, he was. The Italians still respected him. The street crews still feared him. They threw him a parade. But the atmosphere had changed. There was a new power in Harlem, and it wasn't a rival gang. It wasn't the police. It was the Nation of Islam. And the face of that power was his old apprentice, Malcolm X. Bumpy Johnson returned to a Harlem that was in the middle of a civil war for its own soul. On one side, you had the life, the gambling, the drugs, the nightlife that Bumpy controlled. On the other side, you had the moral discipline of the Nation of Islam, who were cleaning up the streets, curing junkies, and preaching black self-reliance without crime. Suddenly, the situation changed. Bumpy realized that the young kid he used to protect didn't need his protection anymore. In fact, Malcolm X was now commanding an army of disciplined men that even the Mafia was hesitant to provoke. Now, we get to the core of the mystery. Why did Bumpy Johnson fear Malcolm X? It wasn't physical fear. Bumpy had faced down hitmen with shotguns. If Bumpy wanted Malcolm dead, he could have snapped his fingers and it would have happened. But he didn't. Bumpy feared Malcolm because Malcolm represented the one thing Bumpy couldn't fight: the truth. Bumpy Johnson had spent his life justifying his crimes. He told himself he was a Robin Hood. He sold heroin, sure, but he paid for turkey dinners on Thanksgiving. He ran numbers, but he paid people's rent. He told himself he was a necessary evil to protect Harlem from white predators. But Malcolm X stood on the street corners and preached a different reality. He called out the poison being pumped into the community. He called out the parasites who preyed on their own people. When Malcolm looked at Bumpy, he didn't see a king. He saw part of the problem. And there is a reported conversation, a moment where Bumpy offered to provide security for Malcolm. Malcolm had split from the Nation of Islam and was under death threats. Bumpy, acting on his old instinct to protect Detroit Red, offered his soldiers. Malcolm refused. He told Bumpy that he could not be associated with a man who poisoned the very community he was trying to save. That rejection hit Bumpy harder than any bullet. It stripped away his armor. It forced Bumpy to look in the mirror and see that his era, the era of the gentleman gangster, was dead. He feared Malcolm because Malcolm made him feel irrelevant. Malcolm made him feel like a villain in his own story. Things got darker in 1964 and early 1965. Malcolm X was a hunted man. The Nation of Islam wanted him dead. The FBI was watching his every move. Bumpy Johnson watched this from the sidelines. He was in a unique position. He had friends in the nation. He had unmatched intelligence networks in the streets. He knew the hit was coming before anyone else did. Sources from the underworld suggest that Bumpy tried, one last time, to intervene. He reached out to Malcolm. He told him, "They are going to kill you. Let me handle it. Let me do what I do." Bumpy proposed a preemptive strike. He wanted to use his hitmen to take out the people threatening Malcolm. It was the only way Bumpy knew how to solve a problem: violence. But Malcolm refused again. He was moving toward a spiritual resolution, not a gang war. He told Bumpy that he accepted his fate. This terrified Bumpy. A man who isn't afraid to die cannot be controlled, cannot be bargained with, and cannot be saved. Bumpy Johnson, and in the master of control, was forced to watch a train wreck he couldn't stop. February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom. Bumpy Johnson wasn't there, but his people were. When the shots rang out, shotgun blasts and pistol fire that took Malcolm's life, the word hit the streets instantly. When Bumpy heard the news, he didn't rage. He didn't order retaliation immediately. He reportedly went silent. The redhead was gone. In the weeks that followed, the streets of Harlem waited for Bumpy to act. And in true, strange, dark, and mysterious fashion, bodies started dropping. While never officially linked to Bumpy, several low-level figures associated with the plot against Malcolm were found beaten or dead. It was Bumpy's way of mourning, a silent, violent eulogy. 3 years later, in 1968, Bumpy Johnson was eating at a restaurant called Wells. He clutched his chest. Heart attack. He died in the arms of his childhood friend. But right up until the end, those close to him said the shadow of Malcolm hung over him. Bumpy had conquered the mob. He had conquered the prison system. But he never conquered the moral judgment of Malcolm X. The mobster feared the minister not because the minister had a gun, but because the minister had the high ground. And for a man like Bumpy, who needed to be the king of the mountain, looking up at someone else was the scariest thing in the world. Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X were two sides of the same coin. Both were products of a harsh, unforgiving system. Both possessed genius-level intellects and natural leadership. One chose the path of the underworld to gain power. The other chose the path of the spirit to gain freedom. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's fear was the realization that his path, the path of the gangster, had a ceiling. He could be rich, he could be feared, but he could never be righteous. And that was the one title the King of Harlem could never steal. If you want to know more about the specific tactics Bumpy used to fight the Italian mob, or the detailed breakdown of the Pax Johnson, we have a video dedicated entirely to that. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next in the story of the Harlem underworld is absolutely insane. Click the next video to see exactly how Bumpy Johnson rigged the numbers game to bankrupt Dutch Schultz. You won't believe how simple the plan was.